The courtroom was abuzz with quiet murmurs as people filed in, their eyes darting between the imposing bench at the front and the well-dressed man seated at the defense table. Charles Whitman, the wealthy and arrogant defendant, lounged back in his chair as if he were at an exclusive club, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, and his air of entitlement impossible to miss. To him, this was just another nuisance, another hurdle his money and influence could sweep away with ease. Across the room, Judge Monica Hayes adjusted her robes, her expression calm but commanding. She was the kind of judge who inspired both respect and fear in her courtroom, known for her sharp mind and unwavering fairness. A black woman in her 40s, she had worked tirelessly to shatter every barrier in her path, earning her position not through privilege but through grit, intelligence, and unshakable integrity. The contrast between the two couldn't have been starker. Charles embodied generational wealth and the belief that rules didn't apply to him. Monica symbolized justice and the relentless pursuit of equality, a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long. As the court clerk called the session to order, Charles leaned over to his high-profile attorney, whispering something that made them both chuckle. His laughter was loud enough to carry across the room, earning him a few disapproving glances from the jury. He didn't care. To him, this was all a farce, a game where the pieces were already rigged in his favor. After all, his father owned half the city's skyscrapers, and his name carried weight in every elite circle. Why would this trial be any different? Judge Hayes tapped her gavel, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "Mr. Whitman, I would advise you to take these proceedings seriously. This is a court of law, not a social gathering." Charles smirked, his confidence bordering on insolence. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't dream of disrespecting you." The subtle pause before the last word wasn't lost on anyone. It hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Judge Hayes' jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. Years of facing prejudice and underestimation had taught her how to keep her cool under pressure, but even she couldn't ignore the palpable tension that settled over the room. As the prosecution began laying out its case, Charles leaned back once more, a smug grin plastered on his face. He wasn't worried. The charges against him, embezzlement and fraud, were, in his mind, minor inconveniences. He had a team of lawyers who could spin gold out of thin air and a bank account deep enough to ensure their best efforts. But as the evidence unfolded, his grin began to falter. Piece by piece, the prosecution presented damning proof. Financial records, witness testimonies, and emails that painted a clear picture of his wrongdoing. Still, he dismissed it all as noise. Money, he thought, could erase even the worst revelations. Then came the witnesses. A single mother who had lost her savings, a retired teacher whose pension had been wiped out, all because of Charles's schemes. Their voices trembled with emotion, recounting the devastation his actions had caused. For a moment, a flicker of discomfort crossed his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. To him, they were just collateral damage, unfortunate casualties in his pursuit of wealth. When the prosecution rested, Charles' attorney rose with an air of superiority, ready to dismantle the case. But before he could speak, Judge Hayes interjected. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice steady, "you seem remarkably unconcerned by the gravity of these allegations. Do you truly believe your actions have no consequences?" Charles shrugged, his arrogance on full display. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been in rooms far more intimidating than this one. I'm confident justice will prevail." The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the judge. Monica Hayes studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, leaning forward, she spoke words that sent a chill through the room. "Justice, Mr. Whitman, is not a luxury reserved for the privileged. It's a reckoning, and it comes for everyone." Charles's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. As the day session ended and the court adjourned, whispers filled the air. What would happen next? Would Charles' confidence prove to be his undoing? Or would his wealth shield him from accountability once again? Judge Hayes watched him leave the courtroom, her eyes unwavering. She knew this case was about more than just one man's actions. It was about sending a message that justice could not be bought, no matter how deep the pockets. And as the doors closed behind him, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the day's proceedings hanging heavily in the air. Charles Whitman exited first, flanked by his legal team, their expressions cool and calculated. Cameras flashed outside as reporters swarmed to catch a glimpse of the man who had become the city's most polarizing figure overnight. Charles, ever the showman, paused briefly to adjust his tie, offering the cameras a confident smile. His attorney quickly ushered him into the back seat of a waiting black sedan, the doors slamming shut to block out the chaos. Inside the car, Charles leaned back, his demeanor shifting from composed to irritated. "This is a joke," he muttered, loosening his tie. "They're trying to make me the villain in some sub-story. That judge, she's got it out for me." His lead attorney, a polished man in his 50s named Victor Lanning, exchanged a glance with his junior associate before addressing Charles. "She's tough, yes, but we've faced worse. The evidence is strong, but nothing we can't work around. You just need to stay calm and let us handle the rest." Charles scoffed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Let her grandstand all she wants. By the time this is over, she'll see that her little lectures won't mean a thing." Meanwhile, Judge Monica Hayes remained in her chambers, the weight of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. She removed her robe and sat at her desk, staring at the files piled high in front of her. The Whitman case wasn't just another trial. It symbolized everything she had worked her entire career to fight against: arrogance, entitlement, and the belief that justice was a commodity for the rich. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from her sister, Tonya. "How was court today? You okay?" Monica smiled faintly and typed back a quick reply. "Same as always. Long day, but I'm fine." She didn't mention the tension with Charles or the way his mocking tone had struck a nerve. There were some battles she preferred to fight alone. As the evening stretched on, Monica dove into the case files, dissecting every piece of evidence. She reread witness statements and studied the financial records, her mind racing with the possibilities. Charles Whitman wasn't the first wealthy defendant she had faced, but something about this case felt different. His brazenness, his lack of remorse, it all pointed to a man who believed he was untouchable. Across town in his sprawling penthouse apartment, Charles poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out at the glittering city skyline. His confidence remained unshaken, but a small part of him couldn't ignore the way Judge Hayes had looked at him in court. Her words had been sharp, cutting through his usual bravado. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came, raising his glass in a mock toast to his reflection. "You've got this, Charles," he muttered to himself. "You always do." But deep down, the cracks were beginning to show. The witnesses' stories had been more compelling than he'd anticipated, and the jury's expressions had been harder to read. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into his mind, uninvited and unwelcome. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the steps, eager to capture every moment of the high-profile trial. Inside, Monica Hayes prepared for another day on the bench, her face calm, but her mind focused. She knew today's proceedings would be crucial. The prosecution planned to call a surprise witness, someone whose testimony could shift the case in an unexpected direction. Charles entered the courtroom with his usual swagger, though his eyes briefly flickered with uncertainty when he spotted the crowd. The seats were packed, every face watching him with scrutiny. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but Charles barely registered it. His attention was fixed on Judge Hayes, who had just taken her seat. Her presence commanded the room, and for the first time, Charles felt the weight of her authority. The day's testimony began with a forensic accountant who painstakingly explained how Charles had funneled millions into offshore accounts. Charts and documents were displayed for the jury, each piece of evidence adding another layer to the prosecution's case. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual smirk replaced by a tight-lipped expression. Then came the surprise witness. The courtroom doors opened, and a man in his late 60s entered, his gait slow but steady. His name was Samuel Price, a former employee of Whitman Enterprises who had worked directly under Charles for over a decade. The room fell silent as he took the stand, his weathered face betraying years of hardship. Under oath, Samuel recounted stories of unethical practices and backdoor deals, painting a damning picture of the company's operations. But it wasn't just the facts that captivated the courtroom, it was the emotion in his voice. He spoke of colleagues who had lost everything, of the betrayal he had felt when the company he dedicated his life to turned its back on him. Charles watched with growing unease, his fingers drumming against the table. He hadn't expected Samuel to testify. The man had signed a non-disclosure agreement years ago, one that Charles had assumed would keep him silent. How had the prosecution managed to bring him here? As Samuel finished his testimony, the prosecution rested their case for the day, leaving the courtroom in a stunned silence. Charles' attorney requested a recess, and the judge granted it, adjourning the session until the following morning. Outside the courtroom, Charles confronted Victor in a hushed but furious tone. "How did this happen? You said we had everything under control." Victor adjusted his tie, his expression strained. "Samuel Price wasn't on the witness list. This was a last-minute move, and we'll deal with it. Don't let them see you panic." "I'm not panicking," Charles snapped, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Just fix it." As Charles stormed out of the courthouse, his mind raced. He had always prided himself on being one step ahead, but now he felt the ground shifting beneath him. For the first time, the possibility of losing seemed real. Back in her chambers, Monica Hayes reflected on the day's events. Samuel Price's testimony had been powerful, but she knew the defense would fight tooth and nail to discredit him. The battle was far from over, and she had to remain vigilant. She stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, Charles Whitman was plotting his next move. But so was she. Justice, she reminded herself, wasn't about power or privilege. It was about truth. And no matter how hard the road ahead might be, she was determined to see it through. The next day would bring new challenges, new revelations. The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension continued to build. But one thing was certain: the fight for justice was far from over. The next morning, the courtroom felt heavier, the air thick with anticipation. The crowd had grown, with more reporters lining the hallways and filling the gallery. Everyone seemed to sense that the trial had reached a turning point. Charles Whitman entered the room with a forced confidence, his sharp suit and polished shoes a thin veneer over his fraying composure. He kept his head high, ignoring the murmurs and whispers that followed him. Judge Monica Hayes, as steady as ever, took her seat, her presence commanding instant silence. Her eyes briefly swept over the courtroom, landing on Charles for just a moment before focusing on the day's agenda. She could see the cracks forming in his polished exterior, the subtle tension in his jaw, and the way his hands tightened around the edges of the table. But she didn't allow herself to dwell on it. This was about more than him. It was about the lives his actions had impacted, and the truth that had to come to light. The defense began its case with a calculated approach, calling a series of witnesses who painted Charles as a misunderstood genius. They spoke of his business acumen, his ability to turn struggling companies into profitable ventures, and his supposed generosity. One after another, they testified, each trying to humanize Charles and shift the focus away from the allegations. Charles leaned back in his chair, occasionally glancing at the jury to gauge their reactions. But their expressions remained unreadable, and it unnerved him. For every glowing testimonial, he couldn't shake the memory of Samuel Price's words or the faces of the other witnesses whose lives had been shattered. He told himself it didn't matter. The jury didn't care about sub-stories. They cared about facts, and his team was working hard to control the narrative. Then came the moment that turned the courtroom on its head. The prosecution introduced new evidence, a series of internal emails that Charles had assumed were long deleted. The emails revealed his direct involvement in orchestrating fraudulent deals, his tone cold and calculated as he discussed strategies to cover his tracks. The room fell into a stunned silence as the messages were read aloud, each word cutting deeper into the defense's carefully constructed image. Victor Lanning, ever the seasoned attorney, quickly objected, questioning the authenticity of the emails. A heated debate ensued, with both sides presenting their arguments. Judge Hayes listened carefully, her face impassive as she weighed the evidence. Finally, she ruled in favor of admitting the emails into evidence, a decision that sent a ripple of tension through the defense team. Charles' confidence wavered. He turned to Victor, his voice low but urgent. "How did they get those? I thought we took care of this." Victor's response was measured but tense. "We'll challenge their credibility during cross-examination. Don't lose your composure." But Charles was losing more than his composure. For the first time, he felt the walls closing in, the realization dawning that his usual tactics might not be enough this time. His mind raced with questions. Who had leaked the emails? Was there someone within his circle who had betrayed him? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside, determined to maintain his facade. As the day wore on, the courtroom became a battlefield. Witnesses were grilled, evidence scrutinized, and tensions ran high. Monica Hayes remained a steady presence, her gavel occasionally striking to maintain order. She watched as the drama unfolded, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. This trial wasn't just about the law. It was a study in human nature, in the lengths people would go to protect themselves or seek justice. Outside the courtroom, the city buzzed with the latest updates. News outlets ran headlines about the explosive revelations. Commentators debated the case on talk shows, and social media lit up with discussions. Opinions were divided. Some saw Charles as a ruthless tycoon finally facing his comeuppance, while others viewed him as a victim of a system eager to tear down the wealthy. The trial had become more than a legal battle. It was a cultural flashpoint, a clash of values and perceptions. Among those watching closely was Rachel Porter, a young journalist covering the trial for an up-and-coming news site. She had been following the case from the beginning, drawn to the story not just for its headline value but for its deeper implications. Rachel had grown up in a neighborhood that had felt the sting of economic injustice, where families like hers bore the brunt of decisions made by people like Charles Whitman. She was determined to uncover every angle of the story, to dig deeper than the surface-level drama and expose the truth. Rachel's instincts told her there was more to the case than met the eye. She began to investigate Charles' past, combing through old records and reaching out to former employees of Whitman Enterprises. What she found painted a picture of a man who had built his empire not just on ambition, but on calculated exploitation. She uncovered stories of whistleblowers silenced through intimidation, small businesses crushed under the weight of his acquisitions, and communities left devastated in his wake. But Rachel also discovered something unexpected, a connection between Charles and Samuel Price that went beyond their professional relationship. There were whispers of a falling out years ago, a rift that had never been made public. The more she dug, the clearer it became that Samuel's testimony wasn't just about justice, it was personal. Back in the courtroom, the defense attempted to discredit Samuel, suggesting that his testimony was motivated by resentment and financial struggles. But Samuel remained steadfast, his words laced with quiet determination. He wasn't seeking revenge, he explained. He was seeking accountability. Charles watched the exchange with a mix of anger and unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel's presence was more than just a coincidence. He began to piece together fragments of their shared history, moments he had long since dismissed. Had Samuel been waiting for this opportunity all along? The thought made his blood run cold. As the day drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Hayes adjourned the session, her voice steady as she reminded the jury of their duty to remain impartial. The crowd filed out, the buzz of conversation filling the hallways. Charles lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on Samuel as he left the stand. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, an unspoken challenge passed between them. Charles clenched his jaw, his mind racing with thoughts of how to regain control. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting to protect the empire he had built, no matter the cost. But Samuel's expression told a different story. He wasn't afraid of Charles, not anymore. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, the battle lines were drawn, and the stakes had never been higher.